Hey guys, Veebat here with another Vplays, and today we're starting out in the hangar because somebody asked me a question that was relatively benign but ended up prompting a little bit of thought on my part. So they asked during the Spitfire 9 review, hey, what do you prefer, the BF-109 or the Spitfire? And you know, that's a generic question, right? Like, I'm sure anybody would be like, oh, I prefer this because I like the history of, or I like the look of, or, you know, maybe a playstyle thing. So I mean, I ended up answering the question, and simply I said I prefer the BF-109, mostly because of the aircraft at the end of the line, but I also enjoy altitude fighters, and that was my answer. But what does that even mean? And I realized that when I first started talking to a few of my friends, and I'm like, oh, it's an altitude fighter, and they're like, altitude fighter? There's fighters, multi-roles, heavies, ground attackers, bombers. I don't see this altitude fighter. Where's the altitude fighter? The way I look at it, when you look at the tech tree and you look at these aircraft, there's a lot of fighters out there. There's a lot of different fighter lines. Typically, there's only one or two multi-role lines per nationality and only one heavy line or one GA or one bomber line. But the fighters, there's a bunch of them. And when I first started playing the game, much like everybody else, you end up finding yourself in the fur balls where all the aircraft is, which is typically at lower altitude, and next thing you know, you're someone that's like, the Mustang's terrible. I hate the Mustang. It's absolute garbage. It always gets outturned. It doesn't have good guns. It just get obliterated all the time. I'm getting killed by Zeros. I'm getting killed by Spitfires. And it wasn't until I started flying heavy fighters that I realized what a heavy fighter can do if I use it properly. I keep it at a higher altitude. I only come down and do kind of gun, like boom and zoom for like that gun and run type of tactic. And it wasn't until I started getting killed by fighter aircraft at altitude that I was like, what? Who's up here? How are they up here? And I started really digging into the stats, and I realized, wait a minute, there's a massive disparity between the way that each one of these fighters performs. And I think all of us kind of come to that understanding fairly early on, but maybe it just took me a little bit longer because I had a weird approach to it. So I decided I'd do a video on how I kind of do a mental calculus of what aircraft I like to go up against and how I am going to engage each target. Because at some point, I'm going to have to go after a target that I'm not going to be in a good position against. So how am I going to do it? Like, how am I going to take my Mustang and go after a Spitfire or a Zero and be able to win that engagement? And so, yeah, I'm going to take you through my mental calculus, but first let's go over some statistics. I have 3 premium aircraft in my hangar that I feel are an adequate representation of the tier groupings when you look at how these aircraft kind of perform. So we have here the A6M3 experimental and the A6M3 premium tier 5 fighter is going to be kind of the epitome of a Zero, right? So you're looking at we don't care about guns right now, but airspeed, maneuverability, and altitude performance, okay? So airspeed, this thing's pretty slow. We're going to go off of max boosted speed because I feel like that's a fair representation for like level flight, full throttle, 317 miles per hour, okay? It's like max, I'm going to run away speed that you're going to see this thing going. Maneuverability, 7.8 seconds. Altitude performance. There's a few numbers in here we really need to pay attention to, but the 2 primary is going to be maximum optimum altitude and service ceiling, and we'll discuss why when we get to the graph. Yes, there's going to be a graph. Maximum optimal altitude, 2,600 feet. Oh, that seems really low. And it is painfully low. But with a service ceiling of 9,186 feet, or 9,200 for the sake of argument, that's not too bad. It means I can theoretically get up to those altitudes. But there's a power loss aspect we need to pay attention to here. Spitfire 1A, so we'll throw the one of my pilots in here. The Spitfire 1A, you're looking at an airspeed of 369 miles an hour. That's pretty good. That's a bit better than what we saw with this 317. So that's 50 miles an hour faster. That's pretty good when you're talking about these type of overall speeds. And again, a maneuverability of 7.8 and an altitude performance of 3,900. So now we're getting like a little bit higher here. It's like nearly 4,000 feet. That's pretty good. And a service ceiling of 10,500 feet, give or take some change. So this thing really can get up to some pretty decent altitudes, right? So this is kind of that's pretty good altitude. I consider that a mid-altitude fighter. Now let's take a look at the 109E3 Premium Tier 5, and this guy is going to have an airspeed of 369. That's a pretty good airspeed. That's going to be able to outpace most things. It's going to be even keeled with the Spitfire. That sucks. But when you look at the altitude performance, 5,900 feet, we just jumped up 2,000 feet compared to the Spitfire 1A. I'll take that. I will definitely take that. And a service ceiling of 12,467, so 12,500. So yeah, we essentially have a nice breakout here, right? We have a breakout of the low altitude turn fighter, the mid altitude fighter. Granted, it's still a bit of a turn fighter, and then you've got this altitude fighter. Now, there's things that they do that are going to balance these aircraft, like mostly going to be the hit points for survivability, and then of course the armament of these aircraft. They're going to have different values, but overall you can kind of see where my head's at, right? So if you stay in these altitude blocks, you're going to have a little bit more success. So let's go ahead and jump over to the graph and talk about this in a little bit more detail. Welcome to the graphing portion for those of you who are enthusiasts for charts and graphs, but this is kind of what I picture in my head, okay? And it looks a little bit busy right now, but so let me walk you through it. We got airspeed in the blue, altitude, this is optimal altitude, max optimal altitude, essentially the altitude block that aircraft will operate in, and then service ceilings. So the line on the far left, you're looking at altitude marks, right? So from 0 to 12,500. Again, I rounded a little bit. You start to see that altitude block comparison I was talking about. And then you also see the service ceiling. The reason I say service ceiling is important, it isn't because you're trying to get up to 12,500 feet or even 10,500 feet. You're not trying to get up there. But what you are going to do is you're going to get a decent gauge of engine power drop-off, which is what I'm representing as this green line. Now, I'm not sure if the engine power drop-off is linear or it's exponential, going above optimal altitude up to service ceiling. I am guessing, so I'm going to do linear because that's a reasonable assumption for the time being with a lack of data inputs. So when you see this, you can see that the 0 over here, or A6M3, if he tries to get up to a Spitfire that's operating at his max edge of his altitude block, you can see that he's going to start dropping off power, which is represented by this dotted blue line here, is going to show you, hey, look, at that intersection point on the far left, we're going to see that this thing is going to have started to lose quite a bit of its power. Not quite all of it, maybe like a third of his overall power output, but that's significant for a 0, so he's going to be in a bad energy state, especially if he tries to come up directly underneath your aircraft. Now let's draw that same comparison over to the Spitfire. If I'm in my BF-109E3 and I'm operating at 5,900 feet and I see a Spitfire start to climb up to me, I know he's also losing about a third of his power by the time he starts to get up to me. And hey, by the way, if I decide to nose up in my 109E3, I know I got a bit of climbing that I can do before I lose a lot of my power. And I can make that Spitfire get to a point where he's actually down to a third of his overall power. And oh, by the way, I'm going to be able to utilize my altitude to then regain my airspeed as I come back on that Spitfire, hopefully as he's starting to fall out of the sky. So this is the calculus I go through. So when someone says, which aircraft do you prefer? I prefer the 109 because I feel like I have more to work with this altitude block than I would with any of the other aircraft. Now you can make this work with a Zero and with a Spitfire, but if you got a 109 that is up at altitude, I get to choose who I want to engage. And I'll take care of the things at altitude first, because I know the Spitfire and the Zero aren't coming up to get me anytime soon. But let's say you're in the Zero and you're dogfighting a bunch of guys down below, and I finished with killing heavy fighters or any altitude fighters. There isn't any mid-altitude fighters. And I see this Zero bebopping around down at lower altitude. I nose down and I go in like a heavy fighter and I do a boom and zoom run. We already know that this 109E3 has a really good airspeed and even better in a dive. I can go through that zone, rip through this Zero who has pretty low hit point numbers, and rip through the airframe and then nose up a little bit, continue that throttle just like you would with a heavy aircraft, and leave the area. I'm not going to be as effective as a heavy, but I can engage that Zero on my own terms. And that's why I kind of like these airframes. But that Zero, if I'm in a 109 and I'm staying at around 7,000 feet, that Zero is never going to get up there. Not without making himself get to essentially a state where he's completely stalled out and it's going to take him a while to get there. So yes, if you were to ask me the question, which aircraft do you prefer? It's going to be it's going to be the 109 over a Zero and a Spitfire because of this. But this is again personal preference and making things work to your advantage. And this is how my mental calculus goes as I start going up against these aircraft. And it works in an inverse ratio as well, right? If I'm in a Spitfire 1A, I know the 109E3 isn't the aircraft I'm going to dedicate a lot of time to. If he comes down, I'm going to be aware of him. I'm going to try to be aware of him. And if there isn't any heavies or other altitude fighters around, I'm going to assume that 109 is coming down to get me. So I'll be ready for him. And when he does, I'll put my guns on target and try to cause some damage to him to the best of my ability. But in the meantime, I can turn and burn with the best of them. There's nothing better, though, than when you're in a Spitfire or a Zero and one of these 109s thinks that he can come down and turn with you. And that's where you really start to turn the tables. But I figured I'd show this to give you guys a good idea. The airspeed on here, the graph is too big, so the airspeed isn't going to give you an accurate representation down here. Let's just say that we know the Zero is slow and the Spitfire and the 109 have decent airspeed. The 109 I feel accelerates a lot better, but that's going to be a different graph and a different comparison. I would like to create a really good thumbprint, like a fingerprint, if you would, for each one of these airframes, where you can look at kind of a graphic like this, and you can be like, okay, I can see where the strengths are, comparing all this data, including airspeed and maneuverability, and get you a good idea of what an aircraft is capable of just in a single snapshot, because I feel like we don't have an effective way to look at an aircraft's statistics and get a good visual of it. I mean, we get that kind of slider bar where they're like, oh, 0 to 100, what's it rated at? I feel like that's an arbitrary judgment. I would rather see a graphical representation that I can compare one aircraft to the other, even overlay them and be like, oh, this one's better at this, so if I'm going up against him, I shouldn't try and engage him on his own terms. Like, as in a 109, I'm not going to engage a Zero and a Spitfire in a turn fight because I've looked at their fingerprint and I know that's a bad idea. And that's what I think I want to start working towards. So let me know down below if you guys think that that's a good idea, because it's something I think I might want to try. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, I will catch you on the next one.